The Adventure of the Hefty Mole. A Blandings Castle Story by A.H. Brazier. Based on characters by P.G. Wodehouse. The evening sun shone brightly over the British countryside, covering Blandings Castle in a beautiful sea of red. The stream nearby gleamed with the sunlight which shone on the windows. An evening like this usually means this is an inevitable sign that the weather would be a beautiful day the next day, but not at Blandings, for the back lawn was in a terrible mess. The flowers in the gardens were drooping, for they had not received any water for 2 days, and the grass was so long it made the lawn look like a tropical jungle. But the real problem for Clarence Fleetwood, the 9th Earl of Emsworth, was a small molehill, right in the middle of the lawn. "Dash it all, Beach," complained Lord Emsworth to his butler, a patient man who observed everything with a keen eye. "If McAllister the gardener doesn't recover from the flu anytime soon, this garden won't get any better before Bertie Wooster pays a visit on Saturday morning." The two men were on the balcony of the castle, which overlooked the lawn and gardens. Lord Emsworth had brought a telescope 2 days ago, and was looking through it down into the gardens below. First onto the lawn, then onto the molehill, then to the flower gardens, and finally onto the small hut in the flower gardens where Angus McAllister, the head gardener, a tall man with a red beard, lived, and indeed now lay ill in bed. Lord Emsworth was a tall man who was fond of new toys. He was wearing his usual tweed suit, which suited him very badly, as well as a hat he had no right to wear indoors, let alone outdoors. He was particularly anxious about the garden, because a son of an old school friend who had deceased some years ago was coming to visit. His valet, Jeeves, was coming Friday morning, so Lord Emsworth was desperate to make a good impression on them both, even if he found valets common. "Just look at it," Lord Emsworth continued hotly. "A proper—" He broke off when he saw his son, the Right Honourable Frederick Fleetwood, on the porch, playing marbles with the cook's son. Lord Emsworth screamed loudly in fury and stormed off the balcony. Thoughts ran through his head as he stormed downstairs to the back door. None of these thoughts were the type which a person wouldn't have if that person was cheerful and happy. They were all thoughts that were things like, "Did I have to let the wife of that layabout have him accompany her over here while she was looking after her cousin? Couldn't Gally have taken Freddy instead of George to Brighton with him? And why must I have this miserable blot for a son as part of the family's history?" Lord Emsworth flung open the back door and stormed out onto the front porch. "Frederick," he barked.
Hello, Governor," stuttered his son, clearly surprised to see his parent red with fury.
The Right Honourable Frederick Fleetwood was a tall young man in a white suit and desperately tried to cover up the fact that he was playing marbles with a scruffy young boy in a school uniform that was in tatters. This was the cook's son, Percy.
Now, Percy, if I mix blue and red together, what do I get?"
Freddy asked Percy, trying desperately to make it look like it was an art lesson, but without any luck. "Purple," replied Percy, unsure why Freddy had changed his tune so quickly in front of his father. Lord Emsworth had only just hired a new cook from London, a single mother with a son, Percy, who got on quite well with Freddy, but had never seen much of Lord Emsworth and so knew little about him.
No, it's green,"
replied Freddy, who had failed in art at school and knew nothing about mixing colours.
"Frederick, the boy knows more things about art than you've had hot dinners," snapped Lord Emsworth. "Anyway, what makes you think you're allowed to be playing marbles at your age, eh?"
Well, Governor, I was just amusing.
If you want to make yourself useful, you can start by going up to London. No, wait, you'll only get into trouble there. You can go to Shrewsbury and hire a new head gardener, and make sure you find one I like, otherwise you're packing your bags on Saturday for America.
Lord Emsworth then rounded on Percy. This time he spoke with a softer voice, but still kept it strict. The fact was that Lord Emsworth once punished Percy for accidentally making ink blots on the best table when he was trying to do his homework. Lord Emsworth had locked Percy in the coal cellar and forgot about him until after dinner when the cook burst into the dining room looking for him. It was Percy's bedtime, and the cook was frantic, having failed to find him anywhere. At this point, Lord Emsworth suddenly remembered Percy and looked guiltily at the cook, telling her everything. When they found Percy, he was cold, hungry, and miserable. The cook then threatened that if Lord Emsworth were to treat Percy cruelly once more, she would hand in her resignation notice.
As for you, Percy, Lord Emsworth went on, tomorrow you shall be in charge of mowing the lawn, first thing in the morning.
Yes, sir, piped Percy eagerly. Lord Emsworth grunted with satisfaction. This boy was common, yet he went about his jobs loyally whenever he wasn't occupied by schoolwork or some childish occupation like marbles. However, Lord Emsworth felt very nervous later that evening. He didn't know why, but when he smoked his after-dinner cigar, he got the feeling that this molehill would be a lot of trouble. So, just to be sure, later that night, just before he went to bed, he took an oil lamp and lit it before proceeding down to the garden shed, wearing nothing but a white nightgown. He unlocked it and took out a large shovel, the hugest he could find. He then strolled out over the flower gardens towards the front lawn and directly towards the molehill. He stopped just in front of it. Then, without any word of warning, he wielded his shovel and obliterated the molehill so nothing was left but a pile of dirt. Unfortunately, Lord Emsworth had hit the molehill so hard that the shovel bounced out of his hands and landed with a soft thud on the grassy verge. Now this thump wasn't enough to wake anyone up at night, but it was enough to attract the attention of Freddie, who was helping himself to a piece of cake from the larder. He had woken up that night feeling rather hungry, and so decided to have a piece of cake as a midnight feast. However, he had just put it on the table when he heard a soft thump coming from the garden, and decided to open the window to take a look outside. He was horrified to see a ghostly white figure on the lawn. Could it be the ghost of Parched, the bloodthirsty butler who had been executed for murdering the 10 masters he had worked for? Scared out of wits and not caring that things can travel through ghosts, Freddie burst open the window and threw everything at the ghost that he came into contact with. Out on the lawn, Lord Emsworth had just picked up the shovel and started to make his way back to the garden shed. Job done, he thought happily, and now to take care of the flowers tomorrow. It was at this point that he was surprised to find a carrot sailing out of the kitchen window and landing in his mouth, followed by a frying pan, which missed him narrowly by inches. Then came a mad procession of kitchen things and food. Lord Emsworth ducked and weaved as much as he could, all the while trying to make his way back to the garden shed, but not without an egg hitting him square on the nose, a tomato knocking off his sleeping cap, and some milk splashing onto his nightgown. Lord Emsworth was in a state of utter rage when he got back inside the castle.
Just wait, he bellowed, waking up half the castle. Just wait until I catch the blighter who made me look like an omelette.
But he was too late, for poor Freddy had been so frightened that he had gone upstairs, got dressed, hastily written a note and gone to Shrewsbury to hire a room at the nearby hotel. Lord Emsworth found the note the next morning on the staircase rail. This note went something like this. Dear Governor, awfully sorry to do a runner and all that tosh, but I've just had a sudden urge to start looking for a new head gardener. I do hope you don't mind taking care of the hotel bills. I've gone off to Shakespeare Towers, where I know they'll suit me very nicely, the sort of binge any reputable hotel does. Yours sincerely, Frederick. It was an utterly enraged Lord Emsworth who then sat down to breakfast that morning. All through the meal he ranted on about his own son chucking food at his father without leaving so much as a by your leave, and once again leaving him with all the bills to clean up. He was in such a temper that no one dared tell him that it wasn't really Freddy's fault. He was scared out of his wits, and perhaps Lord Emsworth should have waited until the next morning to destroy the molehill. This was something half the staff may have been more than happy to point out. They weren't too pleased to be woken up in the middle of the night. To make matters worse, the molehill was still on the lawn. This infuriated and baffled Lord Emsworth, who was pretty certain he had obliterated it the night before. That afternoon, he decided he would get his rifle, point it down the molehill, and shoot the mole.
Yes,
He said to Percy and Freddie's wife Aggie.
if I can't destroy the molehill, I have to find a way to bring down the cause of it.
Crikey! Exclaimed Percy. Using firearms in the presence of a small boy? Inquired Aggie. Father-in-law, I really don't think that's wise.
Who cares?
Scoffed Lord Emsworth and strolled off. But moles are very good, Percy tried to protest, but Aggie simply said, It's no good, Percy. Percy then turned to face Aggie. We have to do something. They both wanted to teach Lord Emsworth a lesson, having overheard Lord Emsworth discuss what he'd do to the molehill with Beach, but they didn't know how. It seems that, after luncheon, Lord Emsworth was intending to shoot the molehill, but Aggie and Percy decided to pretend they hadn't heard a word in the conversation. Fortunately for them both, Lord Emsworth was about to make a huge mistake. He went into the dining room to have luncheon and left his rifle outside the door. Suddenly, an idea flashed into the eyes of both Percy and Aggie. They whispered, discussing their plan with each other. Then, before anything else, Aggie marched straight to the gun and emptied it, taking out the bullets and hiding them in her handbag. She knew a train departed from the nearby station full of rubbish once a week on Tuesdays, and today was that day, so she went straight down to the station in a cart and threw them in the bin outside the station. She knew Lord Emsworth may be furious if he couldn't destroy the molehill, and decided to see if she could stay with her husband, even if it did mean extra expenses for Freddy, who knew how to deal with them. Meanwhile, Percy snuck down into the kitchen and came across a small bag of flour. He decided this was the right sort of thing to put in the gun, and went back as fast as he could, carrying the bag all the way and thinking what a terrific wheeze this would turn out to be. When he got back to the gun, he poured in as much flour as he could, and had just enough time to disappear from the scene before the door opened and Lord Emsworth burst out, grabbing the gun and marching straight to the molehill on the lawn. He was about to take aim when he saw something powdery fall out of the gun. He then drew the gun up to his face and looked down the gun barrel. There seemed nothing wrong with the gun. It looked in good working order. But then he pointed it up to the sky and fired it. The sound of a loud gunshot, followed closely by a yell of anger, and then the splash of water echoed all around the castle. Anyone who had witnessed the scene would tell you that a small white explosion erupted from the gun, covering the top half of Lord Emsworth in a ghostly white, and that, blinded by the flower, he walked not back to the castle, where he intended to go, but instead into the stream at the back of the lawn, where he slipped and fell in. What is more, flour and water combined formed dough, so when Lord Emsworth fell in, he went from looking like a ghost to a human loaf of bread. A most peculiar and indeed entertaining sight met those who happened to be passing the windows that looked onto the lawn. There was Lord Emsworth storming up the lawn, the top half of him covered in what looked like a yellowish white. He shoved open the doors and stormed upstairs to the bathroom, leaving behind him a disgusting trail of white oozing down the stairs. The servants tried hard not to laugh at the sight of him, but Lord Emsworth looked so funny that when he was out of earshot, some of them burst out laughing, while others exploded into lapses of silent mirth, much like a pack of laughing hyenas. Things got worse and worse for Lord Emsworth as time went on. Whatever plan he could think of for disposing the molehill always ended up with either the molehill turning up again the next day, or him having to take a long bath. On Wednesday, Lord Emsworth tried rolling the garden roller over it, but he slipped over on a croquet ball that was left on the ground because at the same time the cook had been trying to teach Percy how to play croquet. Percy had hit the ball too hard, and both he and his mother tried to yell out a warning to Lord Emsworth, but he was so intent on ridding himself of this molehill that he didn't listen. He ended up trodding on it, and, as a result, the roller lumbered right into the flower garden, bringing down 2 entire stalks of tomatoes as it went. That afternoon, Lord Emsworth tried rolling himself over the molehill and jumping on top of the remains. But dinner time proved to be an occasion when one discovers that when one has set out to do one thing before having attempted to do two things, one the intended action, the other somewhat accidental, one discovers, much to one's horror, that one has only succeeded in doing the accidental half of the objective. This was such an occasion. Lord Emsworth had set out to destroy the molehill, proceeded to obliterate it, and discovered that the only thing he had succeeded in was dirtying his clothes. Thursday came, and with it, Lord Emsworth knew the last chance of destroying the molehill once and for all. He spent the whole of breakfast pondering over what to do about the matter. Then he had a brainwave. He marched straight to the telephone with Beach at his side. "Beach," he barked, "call the local building company and tell them to send round the hugest steamroller they have." Beach walked up to the telephone and dialed the number for the Shrewsbury Building Company. "Shrewsbury Building Company," came a voice on the other end. Beach replied to this with, "Good morning, sir. I have a task of some urgency which requires the use of your largest steamroller." "Which road is it? How bad does it look?" replied the building company, clearly thinking they would be mending a road. "I regret, sir, that there are no roads that need mending. Instead, your steamroller is required to flatten a molehill," Beach responded, before pulling the receiver away from his ear, so a loud echo of laughter coming from the phone erupted and echoed around the room. "Tell him that I'm willing to pay the company £10, commanded Lord Emsworth, covering his ears to block out the noise. Beach obediently did so, and the laughter stopped immediately. Recently, the building company was having trouble keeping in business and was willing to take any job offered so long as they got paid for it. "When would you like me to send one over?" asked the building company, now serious. "When would you like the steamroller to arrive, sir?" asked Beach. "I would like them to arrive as soon as possible," Lord Emsworth replied. "Could you arrive as soon as possible?" Beach repeated. "Right away," replied the building company. "Thank you," said Beach, and hung up. At 12 o'clock that morning, the sound of a steamroller chuffing along the road could be heard coming from the town of Market Blandings, which surprised a very distinguished-looking valet, with a black top hat and sleek black hair, with the same patient expression as Beach, and who was also making his way up to Blandings Castle. This was Jeeves, Bertie Wooster's long-suffering valet. Jeeves was particularly keen to get to Blandings Castle in order to see his sister, Gertrude Jeeves the cook, and his nephew, Percy. Jeeves had been asked by Bertie Wooster to go ahead to make sure of this, to which Jeeves was unsurprisingly keen to do so. Having caught the 10 o'clock train, Jeeves decided against taking a taxi. He felt it would be more advisory to get some exercise. Besides, he had seen a confectionery store, and decided to get Percy a shilling's worth of bullseyes. Once he had done so, he proceeded to walk towards Blandings Castle. However, he soon became uncertain if this way was the correct route or not, and so decided to ask the driver of the steamroller for directions. "Excuse me," he called, waving his arms at the steamroller's driver, who then proceeded to slow the steamroller so it came rumbling to a halt. "Excuse me," he repeated, "is this the way to Blandings Castle?" "Oh, yes it is, governor," replied the driver, who spoke in a way this type of driver does, the type that is dressed in overalls, covered in oil and soot, and on a steamroller. "Just down the road is the first big building you come across, and it's just off the first exit. You can't miss it. Would you like me to give you a lift?" "No, thank you," Jeeves called. "I'm quite happy to walk my way over." He politely tipped his hat at the driver, who did the same action back, and both of them proceeded on their way, with the steamroller overtaking Jeeves, who was in no great hurry to get there. Lord Emsworth stood waiting impatiently on the lawn. Suddenly, he could hear a chuffing noise, and looking around him, he saw a column of smoke arise from the distance. "Ah, good," he thought. Then, with a more malicious expression, he thought, "Goodbye, molehill." The steamroller lumbered straight onto the lawn and stopped right in front of Lord Emsworth, who surveyed the steamroller with great impression. This steamroller was of a brand new design. a design fresh from the factory. "Well, here's the steamroller, governor," said the driver, clearly delighted to find a man so interested in steamrollers. "Now if you can just show me which area wants—" "Oi!" The driver's expression quickly changed from joy to fury. This man was the worst type of criminal in the driver's vocabulary. He was a steamroller hijacker. Lord Emsworth was so impressed by this new design of steamroller and was so fond of new toys that he couldn't contain himself any longer. He had thrust the £10 note into the driver's hand and was climbing up into the cab amidst cries of "Oi, that's my steamroller, not yours!" and foot grabbing, which he managed to shake off violently. Lord Emsworth was soon up where the controls for the steamroller were. How do I get this blasted thing started up?" he thought as he lifted up two levers. This started the steamroller, and Lord Emsworth then discovered he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had just taken control of a steamroller without a clue on how to drive it. "Where's the brakes?" he thought, panicking. He then saw a huge wheel. "Ha! Oh, these must be the brakes," he thought with relief. He turned the wheel and saw that instead of stopping, the steamroller was heading straight for the castle. He turned what he now discovered was the steering wheel again, and this time it jammed. Lord Emsworth was now heading straight for the gardens. He tried desperately to pull at a long cable hanging from the ceiling, which was the whistle, but it broke off in his hands. Meanwhile, in his cabin, McAllister, a red-headed man with a beard, lay upright in bed reading The Signalman, a story he had heard of by an author called Charles Dickens. He was clearly on the mend and felt that if he had enough strength later on, he might take a walk around the gardens. Or at least he would have if Lord Emsworth hadn't come crashing past the cabin, destroying half of it as he went. McAllister wasn't hurt. He was in the undamaged half of his cabin, but he wasn't a man who liked people to enter his hut without permission, to enter in on a steamroller, and then destroy the entire kitchen, half of the bathroom and half of his bedroom. He jumped out of bed, hopping mad. "Aye!" he called after the steamroller. "Just you come back here and pay for your damage, you blithering idiot!" He didn't know Lord Emsworth was driving the steamroller. Back aboard the steamroller, Lord Emsworth was in a state of panic worthy of a hedgehog on the road. Desperately, he tried pulling this and that, but nothing seemed to make the steamroller come to a halt, and, hot on his heels, and making their way through the trail of wreckage, came a peculiar crowd, consisting of bedridden head gardener, steamroller driver, butler, and valet, for Jeeves, having just arrived, had witnessed the steamroller crush half of the cabin, and saw a mad chase had already started, so he decided to see if he could be of any help in catching the runaway vehicle. The steamroller chuffed towards a steep embankment. This led down into a muddy stream. Lord Emsworth saw this and desperately turned the steering wheel, and at last it worked. But instead of turning away from the embankment, Lord Emsworth had accidentally directed the steamroller down into the stream. The great machine crashed through the garden fence, slithered down the slope, and landed in the stream and hit the tree opposite with such force that Lord Emsworth was thrown off the footplate and into the stream. The peculiar-looking crowd were soon to catch up with a mud-splattered Lord Emsworth. First came Angus McAllister and an irate driver. They both complained to him at the same time with things like, "Now see here, your lordship, I appreciate you wanting me back on my feet quickly, but you've got to understand it is rude to go about crushing other people's homes. And now just you look at the damage you have done to my steamroller, governor. I'm not paying for a dented funnel, nor am I paying to get the blasted thing out." This conversation would have gone on for much longer, and Lord Emsworth would have gone into a nervous breakdown, had Jeeves not interrupted the conversation. "I beg pardon, gentlemen," he said politely, with the air of one who does not wish to be interrupted. "I think I should take it upon myself to make the apologies." "What have you got to do with this matter?" McAllister asked irritably. I am a film presenter. Reginald Jeeves is my name. I was thinking of making a documentary for the BBC about the history of road power, and I asked Lord Emsworth to drive the steamroller, little knowing that he hadn't the faintest idea how to do it. I forgot to ask if he was any good at driving steamrollers. What is more, gentlemen, I have just heard that the rest of the film crew have been held up by a broken-down engine at the railway station, and was just coming up to the castle to tell Lord Emsworth, having quite forgot that I had asked for the steamroller to come in the morning. But what about that molehill I was instructed to bring down? I can only assume, gentlemen, that when Lord Emsworth's butler made the telephone call, he must have managed to get the instructions mixed up with demands for one of the gardeners to bring down a molehill on the lawn. And anyway, the mole would have probably moved away from this lawn. Moles have excellent hearing, so hopefully the noise from the steamroller would have been audible enough to persuade the intruding mole to evacuate the lawn. Oh, well, if it's all the same to you, Governor, said the driver to Lord Emsworth in a more polite tone of voice. I was on the promise that I would get paid for my troubles. Yes, Lord Emsworth snapped, thrusting £10 into the driver's outstretched hand and taking charge of the situation. Reach! He barked to his butler, now standing by the wreckage. Arrange for the breakdown service to haul the steamroller out of the stream, and for some builders to come and put up the fence, and to rebuild McAllister's cabin. Very good, sir, Beach replied obediently. And get all the gardeners to tidy up the garden, Lord Emsworth called after him. That afternoon saw the gardens of Blandings as the busiest of gardens you'd ever see. 2 men from the building company were putting up a new fence around the lawn and the gardens. A mobile crane, aided by 2 passing traction engines, was pulling the steamroller out of the stream and took it away to be mended. And all the gardeners that could be found in the castle except for Angus McAllister, who was instructing some more men on how to rebuild his cabin, were pulling up plant stalks, disposing of any destroyed plants and broken wood, and covering over the steamroller tracks with dirt and fresh gravel. And right in the middle of it all was Lord Emsworth, directing orders on what to do and where to go, while at his side was Jeeves, silently observing everything with a watchful eye. When they had finished, Lord Emsworth paid the builders for repairing the cabin and the fence, and the men who had delivered the gravel. No one needed to have told them that he had paid a shilling more than he owed them, which was £15 in total, for he was so desperate to make a good impression on Bertie Wooster that he was in a state in which money was no object. The next morning, a wiry figure with brown hair and a suit that matched his hair colour was striding up to Blandings Castle. When introduced to Lord Emsworth by Beach as Bertram Wooster, the newcomer received a warm welcome and proceeded to dine with Lord Emsworth, Jeeves and Percy, who, as Lord Emsworth was so keen to make a good impression on Wooster, was allowed in on sole proviso that he remained well behaved, in the grand dining room, before heading off on a walk around the gardens, which was fortunately now molehill free, for what Jeeves had said about the hearing of moles was true. I couldn't help but notice, Emsworth, said Wooster as they were walking along the gardens, that when I asked a man on a steamroller where Blandings Castle was, he gave me the directions while his face was filled with one of dread, as though he was saying something illegal, and I also saw what looked like the wreckage of a steamroller in the town garage. I can't think why, Wooster, Lord Emsworth lied, for he could guess why the man's face was filled with dread only too well. Just then Jeeves walked over to them, with something of a look that was crossed between seriousness and triumph. Please, Lord Emsworth, there is a telephone call from the BBC and the building company about your accident with a steamroller yesterday. I recommend you respond at once, sir. They are rather furious and would prefer if you attend to them immediately, sir. Oh. Lord Emsworth's face fell in dismay. He walked off, thinking how he would ever get out of this seemingly never-ending nightmare that all started with that blasted molehill. Wooster watched the retreating figure of Lord Emsworth with some interest head back into the house. Then he turned around to face Jeeves. I say, Jeeves, he started, before looking once more at the house and then turning back and asking,
What happened yesterday?
In the hallway, Lord Emsworth calmly put the telephone down. He had had trouble with the BBC and the building company. The BBC were sure that they had not asked for a documentary on the history of road vehicles, and the building company threatened to sue him if he didn't pay for the damage for the steamroller. Both of them demanded him to pay them £50 each. Lord Emsworth had to agree to their payments and informed them that he would make cheques out to them as soon as possible. He walked slowly away from the phone, saying nothing, but had a blank, distant expression on him, the type of one that you get when you are at a loss for words. It was unfortunate that Freddy should then pass by, having returned unsuccessful from his important excursion.
Hello, Governor, he started sheepishly. I'm afraid that I'm having rather a bit of bother with my hotel bill, and I bet a bit the green stuff on the Shrewsbury Smashers cricket team on winning their tournament today with a rather large sum, and that they unfortunately lost, so I was wondering if...
He got no further. While he was explaining his current predicament, the words bill and bit of bother had circulated around Lord Emsworth's head, proving enough to bring him back to earth with a very nasty bump. This was all too much for him. He knew only too well what Freddy was meaning.
So, that's why the driver gave me a look of disgust?
Exclaimed Wooster once Jeeves had finished his story.
Yes, sir, Jeeves replied. I fear that Lord Emsworth is having a bit of a financial difficulty with the BBC and the building company. I had to pretend I was a director of a documentary to save him from getting into a rather unsavoury form of conflict. Well, Jeeves, exclaimed Wooster proudly, it seems you have once again used one of your brilliant corkers to save the day. I wouldn't have any other valet for the world. Thank you, sir, Jeeves grinned.
But his attention was soon turned to a smashing sound coming from the house. The two men turned and saw, to their astonishment, Freddie Freakwood running away from the house, while Lord Emsworth was chasing after him, hell-bent on revenge and shouting about things like blots in the family and first attacking people at night and landing them with bills for hotels and gambling, and at the same time throwing pots, pans and food at him as they raced towards the fence over the stream and out of sight.